Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter's Stories. Beloved Father of all creation, with hearts open wide, we come before you as one family, bound together by the love you have poured into our souls. Just as the ocean is vast and embraces every wave, may our love embrace all hearts that gather here. Bless these stories to be vessels of light, healing, and unity. Let every word remind us that love is the greatest gift you have given us, a gift that sees no barriers, only souls longing to connect. May we cherish each other as you cherish us, without condition, without hesitation. Amen. My cherished reading family, I'm humbled by the love and warmth you bring to this journey. Every time you share how these stories touch your heart, how they make you cry, laugh, and believe in love again, you remind me why I pour my soul into every word. Your presence here is a blessing, and I hold you all close to my heart. My dear ones, it touches me deeply when I see some of our precious white brothers and sisters stepping away. My heart longs for them to stay because love is not bound by color, it is bound by the heart. Look at the beauty of creation. The sky is breathtaking not because of one shade, but because of the harmony of many. The piano sings not with just black or white keys, but with both playing together. The eagle soars with wings of different colors, yet it rises as one. These stories are born from a heart that sees only the light in every soul. Love does not ask about the shade of a hand before it wipes away tears. It does not pause to question a voice before it whispers words of comfort. Love is the language of the heart, and here in our family every heart matters. If my words have ever caused any hurt, please know it was never my intention. My deepest wish is to bring us closer, to create stories that lift us up and remind us of the beauty we all share. I love you all dearly. Your presence means everything to me. If you believe, as I do, that love is the bridge that unites all hearts, comment below with I agree. Let's stand together and show the world that love is stronger than anything that tries to divide us. And now, my beautiful family, I am honored to share a new story with you, one crafted with the deepest love and devotion. Get ready for a journey that will remind us why love is, and will always be, the most powerful force in the universe. With all my love and deepest respect, your Mr. Peter. Chapter 1. One reckless night. Thunder crashed against the Manhattan skyline, nature's fury matching Lennon's sailor's inner turmoil as she nursed her third dirty martini at the summit, the most exclusive rooftop bar in the city. 68 stories up, lightning illuminated her tear-stained reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. Each flash a bitter reminder of how spectacularly she'd failed today. 6 years of climbing the corporate ladder at Edison Communications, countless nights sacrificing sleep for success, all shattered in 20 devastating minutes. The olive in her glass blurred as she remembered the board meeting. Her hands had trembled as she presented the Reynolds account strategy, her voice faltering under Dane Edison's steely gaze. She'd seen the disappointment crystallize in his storm-gray eyes before he'd even opened his mouth. "Miss Saylor," he'd said, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "this is completely inadequate. We expected innovation, not mediocrity." The memory made her stomach churn. Or maybe it was the gin. "Another?" she demanded, her manicured nails tapping against the empty glass. The bartender, Marcus, according to his nameplate, hesitated, concern flickering across his features. "I said, make that 2. The deep voice sent electricity racing down her spine, familiar yet somehow different in this dim, storm-charged atmosphere. Dane Edison himself materialized beside her, his usual impeccable appearance slightly disheveled. His charcoal suit jacket was unbuttoned, his blue silk tie loosened, and his dark hair, always so perfectly styled, was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his fingers through it in frustration. He didn't recognize her. Her brain sluggishly processed this fact as he slid onto the adjacent bar stool. Here was her marketing director, the woman he'd eviscerated in the boardroom just hours earlier, and he didn't even realize it. The lights were low, her makeup was smeared from crying, and she'd let her usually straightened hair return to its natural wild curls. Plus, she suspected he'd been drinking. She could smell the expensive scotch on him, Macallan 25 if she had to guess. You... ... He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face in the dim light. The scent of his cologne, something woodsy and exclusive, made her head spin. Or maybe that was the martinis. You look exactly like... Their eyes met in the mirror behind the bar, and lightning flashed again, illuminating them both in stark white light. In that electric instant, something primal sparked between them. The air grew thick with possibility, with danger, with the kind of tension that preceded either a fight or something far more intimate. "Dance with me," he commanded, his voice rough with emotion and alcohol. It wasn't a request. Dane Edison didn't make requests. He made demands, and the world bent to his will. She should have said no, should have stood up, paid her tab and run for the elevator, should have remembered she was his employee, that he was her boss, that this was professional suicide, should have recalled how ruthlessly he'd criticized her work that very morning. Instead, she let him pull her onto the dance floor as Chris Isaak's Wicked Game began to play, its haunting melody matching the storm's rhythm. His hands branded her waist through the thin material of her black cocktail dress, the one she'd worn to impress the board, now serving a very different purpose. Her fingers found their way into his hair, confirming its softness. They moved together, as if they'd done this 1,000 times before, his thigh pressed between hers, her curves fitting against his hardness like they were carved from the same stone. "Who are you?" he whispered against her neck, his breath hot on her skin. "Nobody," she breathed back, the lie tasting like freedom on her tongue. "A dream, a ghost, whatever you want me to be." His kiss, when it came, tasted like 30-year-old scotch and destiny. When he pressed her against the wall in a dark corner of the bar, her whole body ignited, nerve endings she didn't even know she had coming alive under his touch. His hands tangled in her curls, and she gasped as he tugged gently, exposing her throat to his hungry mouth. "Come home with me," he growled against her skin, and in that moment, she forgot every reason why she shouldn't. Forgot about Monday morning, about professional boundaries, about the fact that she was probably going to be fired anyway after her disastrous presentation. The storm raged on as they stumbled into his waiting car, but they barely noticed. His hands never left her body during the ride to his penthouse, mapping her curves like a man possessed. She knew she was playing with fire, knew she would get burned, but she couldn't bring herself to care. For tonight, she wasn't Lennon Saylor, failed marketing director. She was whoever he wanted her to be, and his eyes told her he wanted her desperately. The elevator ride to his penthouse was a blur of heated kisses and wandering hands. He pressed her against the mirrored wall, his reflection watching them with dark, hungry eyes as he hiked up her dress. She should have felt exposed, vulnerable, but instead she felt powerful, desired, alive. Lightning illuminated his massive apartment as they stumbled through the door, but neither of them bothered with lights. In the darkness, they were just shapes, just heat and need and desperate touches. He lifted her onto his kitchen island, scattering papers everywhere, and she wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him closer. "You're intoxicating," he murmured against her collarbone, and she wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to whatever ghost he saw in her features. She didn't care. Tonight wasn't about tomorrow's consequences or yesterday's mistakes. It was about this moment, this man, this storm of desire that threatened to consume them both. His bedroom was a testament to wealth and taste, all clean lines and expensive minimalism, but she barely had time to notice before he was laying her down on silk sheets that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His weight above her felt right, felt inevitable, like every decision in her life had been leading to this moment. "Tell me your name," he demanded between kisses that felt like claiming. "No names," she gasped as his hands found bare skin. "No past, no future, just now." He growled his frustration but didn't argue, too caught up in the moment to press the issue. Outside, thunder crashed and lightning flashed, nature's own fireworks display matching their passion. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, creating shadows that danced across their entwined bodies. Hours later, spent and satisfied, she lay in his arms, knowing she should leave but unable to make herself move. His breathing had evened out into the rhythm of sleep, and she allowed herself one moment to study his face, softened in repose. In sleep he looked younger, the hard lines of authority smoothed away, revealing the man beneath the CEO facade. She shouldn't stay, couldn't stay. When morning came and sobriety returned, he would recognize her, and this beautiful, reckless night would shatter like glass. Better to leave now, to preserve this perfect moment in amber, untouched by reality's harsh light. Carefully, she extracted herself from his embrace. He stirred slightly, but didn't wake as she gathered her clothes, dressing quickly in the dark. Her shoes in one hand to avoid clicking on his hardwood floors, she padded toward the bedroom door. A flash of lightning illuminated something on his wall that made her pause. Photos, dozens of them. But before she could process what she was seeing, darkness fell again, and she forced herself to keep moving. Whatever secrets Dane Edison's bedroom held, they weren't hers to discover. In the kitchen, she found her purse where it had fallen during their earlier passion. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from her best friend Sophie, probably wondering why she'd never shown up for their planned consolation dinner. She'd have to make up some excuse tomorrow. The storm had finally passed as she rode the elevator down to the lobby, leaving behind a city washed clean. Her reflection in the mirrored walls looked thoroughly kissed, thoroughly satisfied, and thoroughly doomed. Tomorrow would bring consequences, but for now, she had this. One perfect night, where she'd been exactly who Dane Edison wanted her to be. As she stepped out into the pre-dawn air, a strange feeling of destiny settled over her. Something had shifted in the universe tonight, something fundamental and irreversible. She just didn't know yet if it would turn out to be the best or worst decision of her life. Behind her, in his penthouse 60 stories above the city, Dane Edison slept on, unaware that his mysterious lover was slipping away into the night. Unaware that she was his employee, unaware that Monday morning would bring revelations that would shake both their worlds to the core. And in his sleep, he smiled, dreaming of wild curls and soft curves, and a woman who looked exactly like someone he'd lost long ago. Chapter 2. Shattered Illusions. Lennon woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and the soft whisper of Egyptian cotton sheets against her skin. For one blissful moment, last night felt like a beautiful dream. The storm, the dancing, the way Dane's hands had mapped every inch of her body with desperate reverence. Her muscles ached pleasantly, and his scent still clung to her skin, a reminder that it had all been deliciously real. Then she saw the shrine. An entire wall of his penthouse bedroom was dedicated to photographs, the morning light illuminating them like stained glass in a cathedral of grief. Her heart stopped as she took in the images, dozens of them, professionally shot and artfully arranged. But it wasn't her face staring back from those frames. Not exactly. Marina. The name floated up from her memory, whispered in office corridors and board meetings. Marina Chen, Dane Edison's fiancée. The resemblance was haunting, almost supernatural in its precision. the same coffee-colored skin, the same wild dark curls that Lennon usually kept straightened, the same full lips that had just hours ago been pressed against Dane's. But Marina's eyes held none of Lennon's fire. They were soft, dreamy, artistic. In every photo, she looked at the camera with gentle serenity, while Lennon's own reflection in the bedroom's mirrored closet doors showed eyes that blazed with passion and ambition. Her gaze traveled from photo to photo, piecing together a life. Marina in a garden, surrounded by flowers. Marina laughing on a beach, her curls wild in the wind. Marina in evening wear, diamonds glittering at her throat as she gazed adoringly at Dane. And there, centered like an altarpiece, Marina in a wedding dress, beaming at the camera during what must have been a bridal fitting. The dress she would never wear down the aisle. "My fiancé." Dane's voice cracked behind her like thin ice, making her jump. He stood in the doorway wearing only low-slung pajama pants, his chest bare and his eyes red-rimmed. The morning light was cruel, highlighting the shadows under his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands. "You look so much like I thought." Horror dawned on his face as clarity returned, alcohol's gentle fog burning away in the harsh light of day. Recognition flickered in his eyes as he really looked at her, really saw her for the first time since the bar. His marketing director, the woman whose career he'd nearly destroyed yesterday morning. "Get out!" His voice turned to ice, each word sharp enough to draw blood. When she didn't move immediately, frozen like a deer in headlights, his volume rose to a roar that made her flinch. "Get out!" Lennon ran. She didn't bother gathering her scattered clothes, just grabbed her dress from where it lay crumpled by the bed and yanked it on as she fled. Her shoes dangled from one hand, her purse clutched in the other like a shield. Behind her, she heard something shatter, a frame thrown against a wall, she guessed, followed by a sound that might have been a sob or might have been a scream of rage. The elevator ride down was an eternity of shame and regret. Her reflection mocked her from every mirrored wall, smeared makeup, tangled hair, and a dress that showed every sign of the passionate night that had preceded this walk of shame. The security guard in the lobby pointedly looked away as she hurried past, her bare feet silent on the marble floor. Outside, the morning sun was offensive in its cheerfulness. The storm had washed the city clean, leaving behind a crisp autumn day that seemed to mock her distress. She made it halfway down the block before her legs gave out, and she sank onto a bench, shaking. What had she done? The events of the night played through her mind like a film reel stuck on repeat. The bar, the storm, the way he'd looked at her, not as Lennon Saylor, his employee, but as a ghost made flesh. She'd let him believe she was a stranger, let him project his dead fiancé onto her face, let him... Her stomach lurched, and for a moment she thought she might be sick right there on the sidewalk. How had she not known? The rumors about Marina's death had circulated through the office for months before Lennon was hired, but she'd never seen a photo, never realized. A quick inventory revealed what she'd left behind in her hasty escape: her favorite pair of diamond stud earrings, a college graduation gift from her parents, her dignity, and any hope of salvaging her career at Edison Communications. She'd slept with her boss, her recently bereaved, possibly still drunk boss, under false pretenses. There wasn't enough sexual harassment training in the world to cover this situation. Her phone buzzed in her purse, making her jump. Sophie's name flashed on the screen, along with notifications of 7 missed calls from the night before. Lennon's thumb hovered over the answer button before deciding against it. What would she even say? "Hey, remember how I lost the biggest account of my career yesterday? Well, I followed that up by sleeping with our grieving CEO while letting him believe I was his dead fiancé's doppelganger. How was your night?" A taxi drove by, spraying water from last night's storm onto her bare legs. The cold shock broke through her panic, forcing her to take action. "First things first, She needed to get home, shower, and try to wash away the evidence of her catastrophic lapse in judgment. Then she needed to update her resume because there was no way she still had a job after this. The taxi ride home was a blur of self-recrimination. How could she have been so stupid, so reckless? The martinis were no excuse. She'd known exactly what she was doing when she let him believe she was a stranger. Had some part of her wanted revenge for the humiliation of that morning's meeting? Or had she just been lonely enough, vulnerable enough, to take comfort wherever it was offered, even under false pretenses? Her doorman raised an eyebrow at her appearance, but buzzed her in without comment. Small mercies. In her apartment, she headed straight for the shower, turning the water as hot as she could stand it. Steam filled the bathroom as she scrubbed at her skin, trying to erase the memory of Dane's touch. But she couldn't stop remembering the way he'd looked at her in the bar, like she was water in the desert, the feel of his hands in her hair, on her waist, between her thighs, the sounds he'd made when she'd touched him, desperate and needy, and full of a grief she hadn't understood until she saw that wall of photos. Marina's eyes haunted her, soft, serene, everything Lennon wasn't. No wonder Dane had been so drawn to her last night, with her hair wild and her makeup smeared by tears. She must have looked just like Marina in the dim light, must have stirred some deep recognition in his grieving heart. The water ran cold before she felt clean. Wrapped in her fluffiest robe, she curled up on her couch and opened her laptop. Time to face reality. She had some savings, enough to last a few months if she was careful. She could start sending out resumes today, maybe reach out to some old contacts from business school. Her work on the Reynolds account might have been completely inadequate by Dane Edison's standards, but other firms might be more appreciative of her talents. Her phone buzzed again. Sophie, persistent as always. This time Lennon answered. "Where were you last night?" Sophie demanded without preamble. "I was worried sick. I thought you might have done something stupid after that disaster of a meeting." Lennon's laugh came out more like a sob. "Oh, Sophie, you have no idea how stupid." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Lennon Jean Saylor," Sophie said slowly. "What did you do?" "I slept with Dane Edison." The silence that followed was deafening. "Sophie, say something." "I'm trying to decide if I should congratulate you or commit you to a mental institution," Sophie finally replied. "Does this mean you're not fired?" "Oh, I'm definitely fired. He didn't even recognize me until this morning." "What do you mean he didn't recognize?" "Lennon, start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." So she told her. The bar, the storm, the way he'd looked at her like she was a ghost made flesh. Sophie listened without interrupting, a feat Lennon hadn't thought her capable of. When she got to the part about the shrine, Sophie sucked in a sharp breath. "Oh, honey," she said softly, "what a mess." "I know." Lennon pressed her face into a throw pillow, wishing she could smother the memory of this morning as easily as she could smother herself. "What am I going to do?" "First, you're going to let me come over with ice cream and wine. Then we're going to figure this out. Don't do anything drastic before I get there." "Like what?" "Submit my resignation, because I'm pretty sure that ship has sailed, along with my professional reputation and any hope of ever working in marketing again. Just wait for me, and Lennon, it's going to be okay. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually." Lennon wasn't so sure, but she agreed to wait. After hanging up, she walked to her bedroom window, looking out at the city that suddenly felt much bigger and much colder than it had yesterday. Somewhere out there, in a penthouse 60 stories above the street, Dane Edison was probably destroying what was left of Marina's shrine. Or maybe he was already calling HR, preparing to have her escorted from the building on Monday morning. The worst part, the part she could barely admit to herself, was that despite everything, despite the horror of this morning, despite the absolute certainty that her career was over, she couldn't quite regret last night. The way he'd touched her, looked at her, wanted her. It had felt real in a way nothing had in a long time, even if it hadn't really been her he was seeing. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "On my way with supplies. Don't check your work email." Naturally, Lennon immediately opened her work email. Nothing from Dane or HR yet, but there was a calendar invite for Monday morning's regular staff meeting. The thought of facing him across the conference table, of pretending last night never happened while everyone whispered about her spectacular failure with the Reynolds account, made her physically ill. A glint of light caught her eye, her remaining diamond stud earring, its pair lost somewhere in Dane Edison's bedroom. The asymmetry felt appropriate. She'd walked into his penthouse last night as one person and walked out as another, leaving behind pieces of herself she wasn't sure she'd ever get back. Outside her window, clouds were gathering again. Another storm approaching, as if the universe itself was preparing for Monday morning's inevitable confrontation. Lennon pressed her forehead against the cool glass and watched the sky darken, wondering if somewhere in his penthouse, Dane was doing the same thing. The buzzer rang, Sophie, armed with ice cream and sympathy. Lennon took one last look at the gathering storm before going to let her friend in. Whatever Monday brought, at least she wouldn't face it alone. Chapter 3. Office Politics. Monday morning arrived with brutal inevitability. Lennon's hands trembled as she swiped her access card at Edison Communications' gleaming glass headquarters. She'd spent the weekend alternating between panic attacks and frantic job searches, fueled by Sophie's wine and sympathy. Now, wearing her sharpest black suit like armor, and with her hair pulled back in a severe bun, as different from Marina's wild curls as she could manage, she forced herself to walk through the lobby with her head high. The elevator felt like her execution chamber. Each floor's soft chime counted down to her professional death, and she found herself holding her breath as she passed the 42nd floor. Dane's penthouse had been on the 60th floor of his building. Was he thinking about that now, as he sat in his corner office on the 50th floor of this one? Did he remember how she'd pressed against him in a different elevator just 2 nights ago? The marketing department was unusually quiet when she stepped out onto her floor. Conversation stopped as she walked past, replaced by meaningful looks and poorly concealed whispers. Her stomach dropped. Did they know? Had someone seen them at the summit? Or was this just the usual gossip about her spectacular failure with the Reynolds account? Her office, more of a glorified cubicle with glass walls, felt smaller than usual. The presentation materials from Friday's disaster were still scattered across her desk, post-it notes marking all the places where her strategy had fallen short. She'd been so proud of this campaign, so certain it would cement her position in the company. Now those same materials felt like evidence at a crime scene. Miss Saylor. Lennon's heart stopped. Dane Edison stood in her doorway, a statue carved from granite and regret. He wore a different grey suit than Friday's, this one immaculate and unwrinkled, his tie a precise Windsor knot at his throat. No sign of the disheveled man who had pressed her against his kitchen counter, who had whispered heated words against her skin. My office. It wasn't a request. She followed him down the hallway, acutely aware of every eye tracking their movement. His corner office was all glass and chrome, offering a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. She'd been here exactly twice before, once when she was hired, and again during Friday's disastrous presentation. He closed the door behind them with a soft click that felt like a gunshot. Sit. She perched on the edge of one of his leather guest chairs, her spine rigid. He didn't sit behind his desk, choosing instead to stand at the window, his back to her. The morning sun outlined him in gold, making him look more like a Renaissance painting than a man. Did he remember? The question burned in her throat, threatening to escape. Did he remember how she'd gasped his name in the dark, how he'd branded her skin with his teeth? how she'd slipped away in the pre-dawn light, leaving behind an earring like some twisted corporate Cinderella. The Reynolds account. His voice was perfectly controlled, professionally distant, empty. "Fix it, you have 2 weeks." Of all the things she'd expected him to say, this wasn't one of them. She'd been prepared for fury, for cold dismissal, for professional humiliation. Not this. "Mr. Edison, I don't." His knuckles went white where they gripped the window frame, the only sign that he wasn't as composed as he appeared. "Something about you. Just fix the account, or clean out your desk." She should have been grateful. He was offering her a chance to save her career, to pretend Friday night never happened. It was more than she deserved, more than she dared hope for. So why did his dismissal feel like a knife in her gut? As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her at the door. "That perfume." She held her breath. For a moment, the professional mask slipped and she saw a flash of the man from Friday night, vulnerable, haunted, desperate for something he'd lost. Never mind. Dismissed. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving her standing in the hallway with her heart pounding. Through the glass walls, she watched him sink into his chair and put his head in his hands. The gesture was so human, so at odds with his usual imperial presence, that she had to fight the urge to go back in and... What? Comfort him? Apologize? Confess that she'd known exactly what she was doing when she let him believe she was someone else. Her desk phone was ringing when she returned to her office. Sophie calling from her position in HR 3 floors down. "Well," her friend demanded without preamble, "are you fired?" "No." Lennon sank into her chair, suddenly exhausted. "He wants me to fix the Reynolds account." "That's good, is it?" "Sophie, he couldn't even look at me. He just stood there at the window like some tragic hero in a gothic novel and pretended Friday night never happened. Maybe that's for the best. Clean slate, fresh start, all that corporate buzzword bullshit we put in harassment training presentations. I let him think I was his dead fiancé." "No," Sophie corrected firmly. "You let a drunk man make assumptions about your appearance in a dark bar. There's a difference. Now, are you going to sit there feeling sorry for yourself, or are you going to prove to everyone, including yourself, that you deserve that director position in the first place?" Lennon's gaze fell on the Reynolds presentation materials. She'd been playing it safe, she realized now. Too worried about offending the board, too concerned with following established patterns. Maybe that's why Dane had called it mediocre, because she'd been too afraid to take real risks. "I have to go," she told Sophie. "I have an account to fix." She spent the rest of the morning rebuilding her strategy from the ground up. By lunch, her office walls were covered in new notes and diagrams, her computer screen filled with research tabs. She barely noticed when her colleagues walked past, whispering behind their hands. Let them talk. She had work to do. The afternoon brought a mandatory department meeting. Lennon took her usual seat at the conference table, deliberately not looking at Dane as he strode in. He ran through the usual updates, quarterly projections, upcoming campaigns, new client acquisitions. If anyone noticed that he never once looked in her direction, they were too professional to mention it. "And finally," he said as the meeting wound down, "the Reynolds account. Miss Saylor will be presenting a revised strategy in 2 weeks. I expect everyone's full cooperation in providing any resources she needs." The room went silent. Second chances weren't Dane Edison's style, everyone knew that. He was famous for his one-strike policy, for demanding perfection on the first try. Whispers started up again as soon as he left the room. "Did you see them at the summit on Friday?" "I heard she stayed until closing. My friend in security said..." Lennon gathered her materials with steady hands, ignoring the speculation. Let them talk. They had no idea what really happened that night, and she intended to keep it that way. Back in her office, she lost herself in work until the sun set and the city lights came on. Most of her colleagues had gone home, leaving the floor quiet except for the soft hum of her computer. Through the glass walls, she could see light still burning in Dane's office. She should go home, should maintain professional distance, should... A movement caught her eye. Dane stood in his doorway, watching her through the glass walls that separated their offices. For a moment, their eyes met, and the air seemed to crackle with unspoken words. Then he turned away, disappearing back into his office like a ghost. Lennon's hand went to her throat, where a fading mark still lingered beneath her collar. Professional distance. Right. Because that had worked so well on Friday night. Her computer chimed with an email notification from Dane Edison. Subject: Reynolds Account Resources. Her heart pounding, she opened it. Miss Saylor, attached are the complete client files for the Reynolds account, including historical campaign data and market research from the past 5 years. Use them, DEPS. You left something in my apartment, top drawer of my desk. Don't make it awkward. With trembling fingers, she crossed to his office. The door was unlocked, the room dark except for his desk lamp. The top drawer contained a small velvet box. Inside, nestled on black silk, was her missing diamond earring. A note was folded beneath it in strong, masculine handwriting. I'm sorry about Saturday morning. Let's be professional about this. D. Professional. Right. Because it was completely professional to return your employee's earring after a one-night stand where you mistook her for your dead fiancé. Completely professional to pretend it never happened while simultaneously watching her through glass walls with eyes that burned with what? Regret, desire, grief. She slipped the earring into her pocket and returned to her office, aware of his eyes on her back the entire way. The Reynolds files waited on her computer, a mountain of data to analyze. She had 2 weeks to prove herself, to save her career, to show everyone, including Dane Edison, that she was more than just a ghost's reflection. Outside her window, the city sparkled like scattered diamonds. Somewhere out there was the bar where everything had changed. The penthouse where she'd left more than just an earring behind. But that was Friday night, and this was Monday. Time to be professional. She opened the first file and began to read. Chapter 4. Dangerous Games. Dane Edison's obsession with finding his mysterious one-night stand began quietly, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was just a few discreet inquiries. The guest list from the summit, security camera footage from the lobby. But as days turned into weeks, his search intensified, consuming his thoughts and turning every dark-haired woman into a potential lead. She works here, he told James Chen, his head of security, during one of their weekly meetings. The older man had been with the company for 20 years, and more importantly, he'd been Marina's uncle. He was one of the few people who could read between the lines of Dane's carefully controlled exterior. I can feel her presence. Sometimes I catch her scent in the elevator, that same perfume from that night. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly torn between loyalty to his boss and concern for his mental health. Mr. Edison, Dane, are you sure pursuing this is wise? Perhaps it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. But Dane wasn't listening. He was staring through his office windows at the marketing department, where Lennon Saylor sat in her glass-walled office, surrounded by papers and presentation boards. She'd let her hair down today, the wild curls tumbling over her shoulders as she bent over her work. Something about the way the light hit her profile made his chest tighten. Run background checks on all female employees hired in the last year, he ordered, turning back to James. Focus on the marketing and creative departments. She knew too much about the company, about me. She has to be connected somehow. Meanwhile, Lennon worked late every night on the Reynolds account, trying to ignore the weight of Dane's gaze through the glass walls that separated their offices. She'd completely redesigned the campaign strategy, taking bold risks that would either save her career or end it spectacularly. The deadline was approaching, and she couldn't afford distractions, especially not the kind that came with storm-grey eyes and haunted expressions. But sometimes, in quiet moments, when the office was nearly empty, she'd catch him watching her with an intensity that made her skin burn. He never approached her directly, never acknowledged what had happened between them, but his presence was a constant pressure at the edges of her consciousness. One night, alone in the elevator after another late work session, he slammed the emergency stop button between floors. The sudden silence was deafening. "Who are you really, Miss Saylor?" She met his gaze steadily in the mirrored walls, fighting to keep her expression professional despite her pounding heart. "Exactly who I appear to be." "No." He stepped closer, his reflection multiplying in the mirrors until she was surrounded by versions of him, all wearing the same intense expression. "There's something familiar about you, something I can't quite place." His hand came up to touch her hair, and for one heated moment she thought he might kiss her. The air between them crackled with the same electricity that had drawn them together that stormy night. His eyes dropped to her lips, and she felt herself swaying toward him, moth to flame. Instead, he jerked away and restarted the elevator as if burned. "Marina is dead," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Dead and buried, along with my heart." The rest of the ride passed in tense silence. When the doors opened on the lobby level, he strode out without looking back, leaving Lennon trembling against the mirrored wall. Sophie found her in the company gym the next morning, taking out her frustrations on a punching bag. "You need to be careful," her friend warned, watching Lennon's aggressive jabs with concern. "People are starting to talk." "About what?" Punch. "The fact that I'm working late?" Jab. "Or the fact that our CEO can't decide if he wants to fire me or fuck me?" Cross punch. "Both. Neither. Look, James from security was asking questions about recent hires, especially women with..." Sophie gestured vaguely at Lennon's hair. Lennon's next punch missed the bag entirely. "He's looking for me, the me from that night. Can you blame him? You vanished like a ghost, leaving nothing but a diamond earring behind. It's like something out of a fairy tale. More like a horror story." Lennon sank onto a nearby bench, suddenly exhausted. "What happens when he figures it out?" "Maybe you should tell him before he does." "Right. Hey, boss, remember that night you thought I was your dead fiancé? Surprise!" Lennon laughed bitterly. "I'd rather take my chances with the Reynolds presentation." But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. That afternoon, Dane called an emergency meeting of the marketing department. Lennon arrived last, slipping into the only available seat directly across from him at the conference table. "We have a situation," he announced, his voice clipped. "Someone leaked details of the Reynolds campaign to our competitors. Until we find the source, all work on the account is suspended." The room erupted in whispers. Lennon's blood ran cold. She'd been working on that campaign day and night, pouring everything she had into it. Now, with just days until her deadline, Miss Saylor. His eyes locked onto hers, unreadable. "My office. Now." The walk to his office felt like a death march. He closed the door behind them, then stood at the window, his back to her. The same position from that first Monday morning after their night together. "Sir, I know." He cut her off, turning to face her. "The leak came from Reynolds' side, but I needed an excuse to get you in here without raising suspicions." Her heart stuttered. "I don't understand." "Your perfume." He took a step closer, then another, until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I've been going crazy trying to place it. It's the same one she wore that night at the summit." Lennon's back hit the door, Fight or flight instincts screamed at her to run, but she was trapped between his body and the solid wood behind her. "Mr. Edison, the way you move," he continued as if she hadn't spoken, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The sound you make when you're thinking deeply, that little hum in the back of your throat. I've been watching you, trying to understand why everything about you feels so familiar." "Please," she whispered, but she wasn't sure if she was begging him to stop or to continue. His hand came up to touch her hair, just as he had in the elevator. This time, though, his fingers tangled in her curls, tugging gently until her head tipped back. "Who are you really, Lennon Saylor?" The use of her first name sent shivers down her spine. His face was inches from hers now, his eyes dark with something that might have been desire or might have been fury. She could smell his cologne, the same one from that night, and underneath it, the whiskey on his breath. He'd been drinking, in his office, in the middle of the day. "Someone who made a mistake," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Someone who should have said no that night." His other hand slammed into the door beside her head, making her jump. "But you didn't say no, did you? You let me believe—" His voice broke. "Why?" Before she could answer, a knock at the door made them both freeze. "Mr. Edison?" His secretary's voice was muffled through the wood. "Your 3 o'clock is here." Dane stepped back as if burned, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "We're not finished," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "This conversation isn't over." Lennon fled, her legs shaking so badly she could barely walk. In her office, she collapsed into her chair and buried her face in her hands. He knew. Maybe not everything. Not yet. But he was figuring it out. The game she'd been playing, pretending that night had never happened, that she was just another employee, was coming to an end. Through the glass walls, she watched him greet his 3 o'clock appointment with perfect professional composure. No one would guess that moments ago, he'd had her pressed against his office door, his body a cage of muscle and barely contained emotion. No one would suspect that the great Dane Edison was slowly unraveling, obsessed with finding a woman who had been right in front of him the whole time. Her computer chimed with a calendar invite. Tomorrow, 8 p.m., the summit. Sender, d.edison@edison.com. Message, time to finish our conversation. Don't run this time. Lennon stared at the invitation until her vision blurred. Accept or decline. Such a simple choice, with such complicated consequences. Accept and risk everything, her job, her reputation, her heart. Decline and live with the knowledge that she'd let him believe a lie. Her finger hovered over the mouse. Accept. The die was cast. Tomorrow night, one way or another, the game would end. She just hoped they both survived the fallout. Chapter 5. Silent War. The new Reynolds pitch was revolutionary. Even Dane Edison couldn't find fault with it, though Lennon saw how hard he tried during her presentation. She'd spent 3 weeks rebuilding the campaign from the ground up, channeling all her complicated emotions into creating something bold, innovative, and utterly unlike anything Edison Communications had done before. The conference room fell silent as she finished speaking. Board members exchanged meaningful looks across the mahogany table. Dane sat at the head, his expression unreadable as he studied the mock-up spread before him. The tension stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Finally, he looked up. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, Lennon saw a flash of that night in his gaze. Heat, hunger, desperate need. Then his professional mask slipped back into place. "Well done, Miss Saylor." His voice was perfectly controlled. "The board will need time to review the full proposal, but I think we can all agree this is a significant improvement over the previous version." Relief made her knees weak. She'd done it. She'd saved her career, proved her worth beyond any physical resemblance to a ghost. As the board members filed out, offering congratulations and compliments, she began gathering her materials with trembling hands. "Dinner," Dane announced suddenly. He still sat at the head of the table, watching her with that same unreadable expression. The whole team, to celebrate Miss Saylor's recovery. The way he hesitated on that last word made her shiver. Was he talking about the Reynolds account, or something more personal? The invitation felt like a challenge, a move in the complicated chess game they'd been playing since that stormy night. "Le Bernardin," he continued. 8 o'clock. I won't take no for an answer. She knew that tone, the same one he'd used at the summit when he'd commanded her to dance, the same tone that had preceded everything falling apart. But this time, she couldn't run. This was professional team dinner. Refusing would raise more questions than accepting. Le Bernardin was exactly the kind of restaurant where Edison Communications entertained its most important clients. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over white tablecloths and gleaming silverware. The maitre d' greeted Dane by name, leading their group to a private room with a view of the city lights. Lennon found herself seated directly across from him, an arrangement that felt more like psychological warfare than coincidence. Every time she looked up from her plate, she met his eyes, dark and intense in the candlelight. Their legs brushed under the table once, twice, until she was certain it wasn't accidental. Neither moved away. The wine flowed freely, too freely. Lennon watched Dane's glass being refilled for the 4th time and felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. The last time she'd seen him drink like this had ended with her fleeing his penthouse at dawn. "A toast," he announced suddenly, rising to his feet. His eyes locked onto hers across the flickering candles, and she felt the rest of the room fade away. To fresh starts, to second chances, to seeing what's been right in front of us all along. The double meaning in his words made her chest tight. Around them, their colleagues raised their glasses, oblivious to the tension crackling between their CEO and the marketing director, who bore an uncanny resemblance to his dead fiancée. Later, outside the restaurant, the spring rain that had threatened all evening finally broke. Their colleagues scattered to waiting cars and taxis, leaving Lennon standing alone under the awning. Dane materialized beside her, shrugging out of his suit jacket. "Here." He draped it over her shoulders before she could protest. The fabric was warm from his body, carrying that same intoxicating scent that had haunted her dreams for weeks. "I can't," she whispered, but made no move to return the jacket. "Can't what?" "Any of this." The rain fell harder, drumming against the awning above them. A taxi pulled up, but Dane waved it away with an imperious gesture. In the warm glow spilling from the restaurant windows, his eyes were almost black with intensity. "What exactly is this, Miss Saylor?" His voice was dangerously soft. A successful presentation, a team dinner, or something else entirely? She could smell the wine on his breath, could see the slight sway in his usually perfect posture. Memories of another rainy night, another moment of alcohol-fueled attraction, made her step back. "I have to go." "Running away again." The bitterness in his voice stopped her. "Like you did that morning." "That's not fair." "Fair?" He laughed, a harsh sound that had nothing to do with amusement. "Was it fair to let me believe you were a stranger? To let me think?" He trailed off, but the name hung unspoken between them. Marina. Always Marina. "I should have told you," she admitted. "But would it have made a difference? Would you have wanted me if you'd known who I really was?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, his carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. Then his walls slammed back into place. "Go home, Miss Saylor. You've had too much wine." She fled into the storm, leaving him staring after her, still wearing his jacket. The rain soaked through her silk blouse, but she barely noticed. Her skin burned where his jacket had touched her, where his eyes had branded her across the dinner table. The taxi ride home was a blur of neon lights reflected in rain-slick streets. In her apartment, she hung his jacket in her closet, telling herself she'd return it tomorrow. But as she started to close the door, something fell from the pocket, a small, worn photograph. Marina smiled up from the glossy paper, wild curls framing her face as she laughed at something beyond the camera's frame. On the back, in Dane's strong handwriting, "The day I knew I loved her." The day everything changed. The date was exactly 1 year before their night at the summit. Lennon sank onto her bed, the photograph trembling in her hands. He'd been carrying this with him, even to a team dinner, even while watching her across the table with eyes that promised dangerous things, even while draping his jacket over her shoulders in a gesture that felt possessive and protective and confusing all at once. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Saw the dinner pics on Instagram. You need to be careful. This is getting complicated." Complicated didn't begin to cover it. She was falling for a man who was still in love with a ghost who wore her face. And now, after the success of the Reynolds pitch, she couldn't even escape to another job without raising suspicions about why she'd leave after such a triumph. She was trapped in a web of her own making, caught between professional ambition and personal desire, between the woman she was and the woman Dane wished she could be. The photograph seemed to mock her from her bedside table, Marina's serene smile a reminder of everything she wasn't. Another text buzzed through. "The jacket suits you." Her heart stopped. The number wasn't saved in her contacts, but she knew who it was. How had he gotten her personal number? How had he seen? A second text answered her unspoken question. "Security cameras in the lobby. You should be more careful about what you take from my pockets, Miss Saylor." She stared at her phone until the screen went dark, then light again with another message. "We need to talk. Properly this time. No more running." The cursor blinked in the empty reply field. What could she possibly say? "Sorry I look like your dead fiancé. Sorry I let you believe I was someone else. Sorry I'm not her." Instead, she placed the photograph in an envelope and wrote his home address on the front. Tomorrow, she'd mail it back along with his jacket. Tomorrow, she'd reinforce the professional boundaries that had blurred so dangerously tonight. Tomorrow, she'd be stronger. But tonight, alone in her apartment with the storm raging outside, she let herself remember how it felt to be in his arms. How for one perfect night, she'd been exactly who he wanted her to be. How even now, knowing everything, part of her wished she could be that person again. The rain fell harder, and somewhere across the city, in a penthouse with a wall of photographs, Dane Edison stared at his phone and waited for a reply that wouldn't come. Chapter 6. Confrontation. "You're fired." The words fell like bombs in the quiet of Lennon's office. Dane Edison stood in her doorway, a manila folder clutched in his white-knuckled grip. Early morning sunlight streamed through the glass walls, turning him into a dark silhouette rimmed in gold. "What?" She stood so quickly her chair rolled back and hit the wall. "Why?" "Because I can't think straight with you here." His composure cracked like thin ice, revealing the turbulent depths beneath. The folder slammed onto her desk, scattering papers. "Because every time I see you, I remember that night at the bar, because you remind me of..." He stopped abruptly, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time, really seeing her. Lennon's blood turned to ice as understanding dawned in his eyes. She'd worn her hair natural today, too rushed after a late night working to straighten it. Her makeup was minimal, letting her natural features shine through, features that in this light were hauntingly familiar. "That perfume," he whispered, taking a step closer. His eyes darkened with recognition. That night. She ran. Fight or flight instincts took over, and she chose flight, bolting past him into the hallway. Behind her, she heard him curse, then the sound of expensive shoes on marble as he gave chase. The elevator would be too slow. She hit the stairwell door at full speed, taking the steps 2 at a time. Her heels echoed in the concrete chamber, betraying her location. Above her, another door slammed. He was following. "Stop running!" His voice bounced off the walls, multiplying until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. 10 floors down, 15. Her legs burned, but fear and adrenaline kept her moving. "You don't understand. Then make me understand." Their shouts echoed through the stairwell, a twisted duet of accusation and desperation. At the 25th floor, a stitch in her side forced her to slow. The door above her crashed open, and she heard him taking the stairs 3 at a time, closing the distance between them. She burst out onto the 24th floor, marketing's backup storage room, filled with old campaign materials and forgotten presentations. Rows of filing cabinets created a maze of metal and shadow. She ducked behind a tall shelf, trying to control her ragged breathing. The stairwell door opened slowly. His footsteps were measured now, deliberate, a predator stalking its prey. "It was you." His voice broke on the last word, the sound bouncing off filing cabinets and making her jump. "At the bar, in my bed, it was you. Nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide." "Yes." His laugh was bitter, cutting through the dim light like a blade. "Did you plan it? Seduce the grieving CEO? Was this some elaborate scheme to save your job after the Reynolds disaster?" "No." The denial burst from her with such force that it gave away her location. She heard him moving between the shelves, getting closer. "I was drunk, heartbroken about the account. You let me believe. You wanted to believe." She stepped out from behind the cabinet, facing him at last. In the dim light filtering through dusty windows, his eyes were almost black with emotion. "You saw what you wanted to see." He slammed his hand against the metal shelf beside her head, making the whole unit rattle. The sound echoed through the empty room like a gunshot. "I saw you!" The kiss was violent, desperate, inevitable. His mouth crashed into hers with none of the gentleness from that first night, all teeth and tongue and suppressed rage. She tasted his anger, his grief, his need. When they broke apart, both were crying. "I can't be her," Lennon whispered, her voice raw. Her lips felt bruised, her body electric where he pressed against her. "I don't want you to be." But his eyes said something different as they traced her features, cataloging all the ways she matched Marina's ghost. His hands were still braced on either side of her head, caging her against the filing cabinet. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell that intoxicating combination of cologne and skin that had haunted her dreams for weeks. "Then what do you want?" She forced herself to meet his gaze, to face whatever truth she found there. "I want ... He pressed his forehead against hers, his breath ragged. "I want to understand why. Why you let me believe you were a stranger, why you ran, why every time I close my eyes, I see your face instead of hers." "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "That night when you looked at me like I was everything you'd ever wanted. I knew it wasn't really me you were seeing, but I wanted it to be. Just for one night, I wanted to be that person." "And now?" His fingers traced her jaw, tilting her face up to his. "Who are you now, Lennon Saylor?" The use of her full name sent shivers down her spine. "I'm just me. Take it or leave it." He kissed her again, softer this time, but no less desperate. His hands tangled in her hair, and she gasped as he tugged gently, angling her head to deepen the kiss. Her fingers clutched at his shirt, wrinkling the expensive fabric. "I should hate you," he murmured against her lips. "Should fire you, should never want to see your face again." "Then do it." She pushed at his chest, creating space between them. Fire me. Let me go. We both know this can't end well. Can't it? His eyes searched hers, looking for something. Permission, understanding, absolution. What if this was always how it was supposed to end? What if you walking into that bar that night wasn't an accident? Don't. She pressed her hands against his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palms. Don't try to make this into some kind of destiny. I'm not her replacement. I won't be her ghost. No, he agreed, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. You're nothing like her. Marina was gentle, serene. You're all fire and ambition and sharp edges. You challenge me, infuriate me, make me feel things I thought died with her. And that's enough? She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. Being your wake-up call, your reason to feel again? I don't know. His honesty was like a physical blow. But I know I can't keep pretending. Can't keep watching you through glass walls and pretending I don't remember how you taste, how you feel, how you say my name when... Stop. She pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. We can't do this here. Not like this. He caught her wrist, pressing a kiss to her palm that made her whole body tremble. Then where? When? Because I'm tired of pretending, Lennon. Tired of fighting this. Whatever this is. The sound of voices in the hallway made them both freeze. Reality came crashing back. They were in the office, surrounded by years of company history, preserved in manila folders and digital archives. Their colleagues were arriving for the day, unaware of the drama unfolding in the storage room. Tonight, she heard herself say, my place, we'll talk, really talk. He nodded, stepping back and straightening his tie. In seconds, he transformed back into Dane Edison, CEO, all evidence of their confrontation erased, except for the slight swelling of his lips and the darkness in his eyes. 8 o'clock, he said, his voice steady. Don't run this time. She watched him walk away, his expensive shoes clicking on the marble floor. Through the dusty windows, she could see the city coming alive, unaware that her world had just tilted on its axis once again. Her phone buzzed. Sophie, probably wondering why she wasn't at her desk. But how could she explain what had just happened? How could she put into words the way Dane had looked at her, like she was simultaneously everything he wanted and everything he feared? The storage room felt too small suddenly, too full of charged air and unspoken words. She needed to think, needed to decide if she was ready for whatever would happen tonight. Because one thing was certain. After this morning, there was no going back to professional distance and glass walls. She touched her lips, still feeling the ghost of his kiss. Above her, the fluorescent lights hummed, casting shadows that looked almost like Marina's photographs, watching and waiting to see what would happen next. Chapter 7. Truth and Consequences. It was you. Dane's voice cracked like thin ice as he paced Lennon's living room. Evening light filtered through her apartment windows, painting shadows across his anguished features. At the bar, in my bed, it was you. Yes. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with weeks of secrets and lies. His laugh was bitter enough to make her flinch. Did you plan it? Seduce the grieving CEO? Was that your backup plan after the Reynolds disaster? No. The denial burst from her with such force that he stopped pacing. I was drunk, heartbroken about the account. You let me believe. You wanted to believe. She stood from her perch on the couch arm, her own anger finally breaking free. You saw what you wanted to see. You looked at me and saw her, and I was weak enough to let you. He slammed his hand against the wall beside her head, caging her with his body. The framed photos of her family rattled with the impact. I saw you! The kiss was violent, desperate, inevitable. She tasted his anger, his grief, his need. His hands tangled in her hair, tugging until she gasped against his mouth. When they broke apart, both were crying. "I can't be her," Lennon whispered, her voice breaking on the truth she'd been running from for weeks. "I don't want you to be." But his eyes betrayed him as they traced her features, cataloguing every similarity to the ghost that haunted them both. They stood there for a long moment, breaths mingling, bodies pressed together against her living room wall. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one, creating a constellation of artificial stars that witnessed their confession. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was softer now, wounded. "That morning, when you saw the photos, would it have made a difference?" She pushed gently at his chest, creating space between them. "Would you have wanted me if you'd known I was just your marketing director? Just another employee who happened to look like—" "Don't." His fingers pressed against her lips, silencing her. "Don't say her name. Not now. We have to talk about her." Lennon caught his hand, twining their fingers together. "She's the reason we're here. The reason you looked at me that night like I was water in the desert. The reason you can barely look at me now without flinching." He pulled away, running his hands through his hair until it stood on end. Gone was the perfectly polished CEO. This was Dane stripped raw, all his carefully constructed walls crumbling. "I see her everywhere," he admitted, his voice rough. "In crowds, in dreams, in every dark-haired woman who passes my office. But with you, it's different. You're not just her echo, you're—" "What?" She stepped closer, drawn to his vulnerability like a moth to flame. "What am I to you, Dane? Real." The word seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. "You're real and alive and nothing like her except in the ways that make me hate myself for wanting you. Then stop wanting me." The words hurt to say, but she forced them out. "Fire me. Let me go. We both know this can't end well." He crossed the room in 2 strides, catching her face between his hands. "I can't. God help me, Lennon, I've tried. Every morning I tell myself today's the day I'll be professional. Today's the day I'll stop watching you through those glass walls. Stop remembering how you felt in my arms." His thumbs brushed away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I'm not her," she whispered again, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was a plea. "No." His eyes searched hers, storm gray and intense in the fading light. "You're nothing like her. Marina was gentle, artistic. She saw beauty in everything. You're all fire and ambition and sharp edges. You challenge me, infuriate me, make me feel things I thought died with her. And that's enough." She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "Being your wake-up call? Your reason to feel again?" Instead of answering, he kissed her. Not like before. No violence, no desperation. This kiss was slow, thorough, like he was trying to memorize every detail. His hands slid into her hair, gentler this time, cradling rather than claiming. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know what this is," he admitted. "I don't know if it's enough or too much or completely insane. All I know is that when I'm with you, I stop seeing ghosts." "Dane." Her hands fisted in his shirt, wrinkling the expensive fabric. "We can't just ignore what happened. The lies, the deception—" "No." He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "No more lies, no more pretending. Just this, whatever this is." "And what about Monday?" Reality intruded like an unwelcome guest. "What about the office, the board, your reputation?" "I don't care." But even as he said it, she saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Dane Edison had built his empire on control, on perfect composure, on never letting personal matters affect business decisions. And she was chaos incarnate. "You do care." She touched his face, feeling the tension in his jaw. "And you should. Edison Communications is your legacy. I won't be the scandal that brings it down." "Then what do you suggest?" His voice held a dangerous edge. We go back to pretending, professional distance and glass walls, while I watch other men flirt with you at client meetings. The possessiveness in his tone sent shivers down her spine. Is that what this is about? Marking your territory? This is about not being able to breathe when you're in the room. The words exploded from him with such force that they both flinched. About spending every meeting fighting the urge to touch you, kiss you, make you mine again. About hating myself for wanting you, and hating you for making me want you, and hating that I can't tell if it's really you I want, or just the ghost of her I see in your face. The truth hung between them like shattered glass, beautiful and dangerous and impossible to ignore. Lennon felt tears sliding down her cheeks again, but this time she didn't try to hide them. I can't compete with a ghost, she whispered, and I won't try to replace her. I'm not asking you to. He caught her hands, pressing them against his chest where his heart thundered beneath her palms. I'm asking you to help me remember how to live again. And if I can't, if this ends with both of us broken beyond repair? His smile was sad but real. The first genuine smile she'd seen from him since that night at the bar. Sweetheart, I'm already broken. The question is whether we're stronger together or apart. Outside her window, the city sparkled like scattered diamonds. Somewhere out there was the bar where everything had changed, the penthouse where Marina's photos still watched from the walls. But here, in the growing darkness of her apartment, there were no ghosts. Just two people trying to find their way back to solid ground. Stay, she heard herself say. Not like that night. Just stay. Talk to me. Help me understand. He nodded, letting her lead him to the couch. They sat in the gathering darkness, neither reaching for the lights, and began the long process of unraveling truth from lies, reality from memory, love from grief. And if his hand found hers in the darkness, if their fingers twined together like they'd done this 1,000 times before, well, maybe that was its own kind of truth. Chapter 8. War of Hearts. But it wasn't that simple. Nothing ever was when it came to matters of the heart, especially hearts as complicated as theirs. The board demanded her resignation when rumors of their relationship began to circulate. Whispers followed them through the corridors of Edison Communications, whispers about inappropriate relationships, about grief and manipulation, about a CEO losing his grip on reality. Dane fought for her, publicly, professionally, with all the considerable power at his disposal. He shut down the rumors with icy precision, threatened lawsuits against anyone who dared question her qualifications, defended her work on the Reynolds account with a ferocity that would have been impressive if it wasn't so terrifying. But privately, I don't know how to trust you, he admitted late one night in his office. The city sparkled beyond his windows, a tapestry of lights that seemed to mock their darkness. He stood with his back to her, silhouetted against the skyline, a tumbler of scotch untouched in his hand. Then don't. Lennon's voice was steady, despite the trembling in her hands. Trust yourself. What do you feel when you look at me now? Everything. He turned to face her, his eyes dark with emotions she couldn't name. Nothing. I can't. The space between them felt like an ocean, though it was only a few feet of expensive carpet. She'd been avoiding being alone with him since that night in her apartment, since they'd talked until dawn about Marina, about guilt, about the fine line between memory and obsession. She turned to leave, unable to bear the weight of his gaze any longer. The door handle was cold under her palm, grounding her in reality when everything else felt like a dream or nightmare. Lennon. Her name on his lips stopped her like a physical touch. Stay. One word, two syllables, a universe of meaning. She let her hand fall from the door, but didn't turn around. Why? Because when you leave, The ghosts come back. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Slowly, she turned to face him. He'd moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne. Different from the one he'd worn that first night, she noticed. He'd been making small changes like that, subtle attempts to separate himself from the man he'd been with Marina. "I can't fight them for you," she said softly. "Your ghosts are your own." "I know." He reached for her, his fingers brushing her cheek with aching gentleness. "But when you're here, they're quieter." She leaned into his touch despite herself. The board. Fuck the board. The vehemence in his voice made her jump. "They don't understand. They see numbers, liability, potential scandal. They don't see..." "What?" She caught his hand, pressing it more firmly against her cheek. "What do they not see, Dane? How you've brought color back into my world." His other hand came up, framing her face. "How for the first time since she died, I can breathe without feeling like I'm drowning. How every morning I wake up terrified that this has all been a dream, that I'll come to the office and find your desk empty. I'm not going anywhere." The promise slipped out before she could stop it. "Unless you tell me to." His kiss was gentle this time, nothing like the desperate clashes they'd shared before. His lips moved over hers like he was discovering her for the first time, memorizing every detail. When they broke apart, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I fired James," he murmured against her lips. The non sequitur made her blink. "Your head of security, Marina's uncle. Why?" "Because he was the one spreading the rumors, trying to protect Marina's memory," he said, "as if tarnishing you somehow honored her." His jaw clenched, as if she would have wanted any of this. "He was grieving too," Lennon reminded him gently. "You're not the only one who lost her." "No." His fingers traced the curve of her jaw, like he was trying to memorize her features by touch. "But I'm the only one who found you." The words should have been romantic, but they sent a chill down her spine. "Dane, you haven't found me. You've known me all along. As your employee, your marketing director. The woman who failed spectacularly with the Reynolds account and then succeeded even more spectacularly. That's who I am. Not some mysterious stranger from a bar. Not Marina's ghost made flesh. Just me." He stepped back, running a hand through his hair until it stood on end. The gesture was so human, so unlike his usual controlled demeanor, that it made her heart ache. "I know who you are," he said finally. "That's what terrifies me. Because the woman I met that night at the bar, she was safe, a fantasy, a dream I could wake up from. But you're real, complicated, brilliant and infuriating and absolutely nothing like what I should want. But you do want me." It wasn't a question. "God help me, yes." He moved to the window again, staring out at the city lights. "More than I've wanted anything since her." The ghost of Marina seemed to hover between them, as tangible as the desk that separated them. Lennon could almost see her reflection in the window glass, superimposed over their own. "Earlier today," she said carefully, "in the board meeting, when you defended my work on the Reynolds account, was that about me or about proving something to yourself?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with honesty. "Both. Neither. I don't know anymore. Everything's tangled up. Who you are, who she was, who I was then and who I am now. Sometimes I look at you and see only you, brilliant and fierce, and everything I never knew I needed. And sometimes you see her," she finished when he trailed off. "It's okay. I understand." "No." He turned to face her, his expression fierce. "It's not okay. You deserve better than half of someone's heart." "Is that what you're offering? Half your heart?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, a reminder that the world continued turning despite their private drama. "I don't know what I'm offering," he admitted. "I just know I can't let you go. Not again. Not like that morning in my penthouse." She crossed to him slowly, each step measured and deliberate. When she reached him, she placed her hand over his heart, feeling its steady rhythm beneath her palm. "Then don't let me go," she whispered. "But don't try to make me into something I'm not. Don't look for her in my face or try to find her in my laugh. If we do this, really do this, it has to be about us. Not ghosts, not memories, not what-ifs. Just us." His hand covered hers where it rested on his chest. "And if I can't, if I'm not ready, then I'll walk away, and this time I won't come back." The ultimatum wasn't meant to be cruel, but she saw him flinch as if she'd struck him. His fingers tightened on hers, almost painfully. "Stay," he said again, but this time it sounded different. Not a command or a plea, but a choice. "Stay and help me remember how to live without ghosts." Outside his office, the world waited with all its complications, board meetings and rumors, professional boundaries and personal demons. But here, in this moment, there was only this. His heartbeat under her hand, his eyes fixed on hers with desperate hope, and the possibility of something real growing in the space between memory and desire. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll stay." Chapter 9. Breaking Point. A rival firm leaked photos of their night together at the summit. The images were grainy, security camera screenshots showing Dane pressing Lennon against the wall in a dark corner, their bodies entwined in what was clearly more than a professional embrace. The media exploded with lurid headlines that spread across New York like wildfire. "Grieving CEO seduced by Marina lookalike." The story was everywhere. Business news, gossip columns, social media. Every outlet had their own spin, but they all painted the same picture: the tragic CEO, the manipulative employee, the sacred memory defiled. Their private pain became public spectacle, dissected and analyzed by strangers who knew nothing of the truth. Dane went nuclear. He threatened lawsuits against every publication that ran the story, deployed his army of lawyers to issue cease and desist orders, defended her honor with a ferocity that would have been touching if it wasn't so terrifying. In board meetings, he shut down any mention of the scandal with Arctic precision, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made even hardened executives flinch. Then, Marina's parents got involved. "How dare you sully her memory?" The words echoed through the executive floor as Marina's mother confronted Dane in his office. Lennon, passing by, froze at the raw anguish in the older woman's voice. "Our daughter isn't even cold in her grave, and you're parading around with this copy." Through the glass walls, Lennon watched Dane's face turn to stone. "Mrs. Chen, with all due respect." "Respect?" Marina's father cut in, his accent thickening with emotion. "You speak of respect while you dishonor our daughter, while you replace her with some corporate climber who happens to share her face." Lennon fled to her office, but their voices followed her. All day, she watched the drama unfold through the fishbowl walls that had become both shield and prison. She saw Dane's perfect posture crack under the weight of their accusations, saw him age years in hours as they forced him to confront the ghosts he'd been trying to outrun. That night, she found him in his penthouse, destroying the shrine that had haunted them both. Shattered glass crunched under her heels as she entered the bedroom. Photos lay scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, many torn or crumpled. Marina's serene smile looked up at them from 100 angles, witness to their shared breakdown. Blood dripped from Dane's knuckles where he'd punched the wall, leaving crimson constellations on the cream paint. He didn't acknowledge her presence, just stood staring at the devastation he'd created. "Let me help," she whispered, reaching for his injured hand. "I don't deserve help." His voice was raw, stripped of its usual polish. "I betrayed her. No. She caught his face between her hands, forcing him to look at her. You lived. That's what she would have wanted. His laugh was bitter enough to cut. How would you know what she wanted? You never met her. You're just wearing her face like a mask, playing at being... She slapped him. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot, shocking them both into silence. His cheek reddened where her hand had connected, but his eyes finally focused on her, really on her, not on Marina's ghost. I am not her. Each word was precise, carved from ice and steel. I never tried to be her. You're the one who saw her in me that night, who projected your grief onto a stranger in a bar. I let you believe what you wanted because I was drunk and hurt and lonely, and you looked at me like I was everything you'd ever wanted. That was wrong of me, and I'm sorry, but I will not stand here and let you pretend that I somehow tricked you into betraying her memory. He stared at her like he'd never seen her before. Maybe he hadn't. Not really. Not past the superficial resemblance that had drawn them together that stormy night. She would have never slapped me, he said finally, touching his cheek with something like wonder. No, she wouldn't have. Because she was gentle and kind and everything I'm not. I'm not your angel, Dane. I'm not your salvation or your punishment or your second chance. I'm just a woman who made a mistake, who fell for a man who couldn't see past his own grief to recognize what was right in front of him. She turned to leave, her heels crunching on broken glass. Behind her, she heard him move, felt his hand catch her wrist. Wait. The word was rough, desperate. Please. She didn't turn around, but she didn't pull away either. Why? So you can punish us both more? So you can keep trying to turn me into something I'm not? So I can apologize. His grip loosened, but didn't release entirely. You're right. About all of it. I saw what I wanted to see that night, and I've been seeing what I wanted to see ever since. It wasn't fair to you. Now she did turn, studying his face in the dim light. Blood still dripped from his knuckles, staining the expensive carpet. All around them, Marina's photos watched their confession like silent judges. Then see me now, she challenged. Really see me. Not her ghost, not your fantasy, not whatever redemption story you're trying to write. Just me. He stepped closer, his free hand coming up to trace her features. This time, though, it felt different. Like he was discovering her for the first time, rather than comparing her to a memory. I see you, he whispered. God help me. I see you. And what do you see? Fire. His thumb brushed her lips, still swollen from their earlier kisses. Strength. A woman who doesn't need saving or protecting, who challenges me, fights me, makes me remember what it feels like to want something real instead of chasing ghosts. Is that enough? She had to ask. Had to know if they were just trading one fantasy for another. Instead of answering, he kissed her, not like before. No desperation, no grief, no ghosts between them. This kiss tasted like truth, like acceptance, like the beginning of something real. When they broke apart, both were crying. Around them, Marina's photos seemed less accusing now, more like witnesses to a transformation neither of them had seen coming. Help me clean this up, he said quietly. Not just the glass, all of it. Help me learn how to remember her without letting her ghost destroy what's right in front of me. Together they began gathering the scattered photos. Some they saved, carefully placing them in a box to be stored away. Others, too damaged to salvage, they let go. With each piece they picked up, each memory they sorted through, something shifted between them, something fragile and new, growing in the space where grief had lived. Outside, the city lights sparkled like the broken glass beneath their feet. Somewhere out there, Marina's parents were probably planning their next move. The media was crafting new headlines, and the board was discussing damage control. But here, in this room where everything had started and ended and started again, none of that mattered. They had finally reached their breaking point, and somehow, impossibly, they were still standing. Chapter 10. Healing Hearts. They rebuilt slowly. Professional distance at work became their shield against prying eyes and whispered rumors. Glass walls that had once imprisoned them now protected the fragile thing growing between them. During the day, they were Mr. Edison and Miss Saylor, CEO and marketing director, nothing more than colleagues working to maintain Edison Communications' sterling reputation. But in the evenings, away from fluorescent lights and corporate politics, they began to really know each other. Private dinners in out-of-the-way restaurants where they could talk without performing for an audience. Long walks through Central Park where Dane told her about Marina. Not the saint everyone had made her out to be after her death, but the real woman with quirks and flaws and a laugh that could light up a room. She used to burn everything she tried to cook, he said one night, as they sat on his balcony watching the sunset. Literally everything, even microwave popcorn. The fire department knew us by name. Lennon laughed, surprised by the lightness in his voice. It was the first time he'd spoken about Marina without that edge of grief that usually colored his memories. "I'm not much better," she admitted. "I survive on takeout and protein bars. The most complicated thing I can make is coffee." "I know." His smile was soft, genuine. "I've seen your desk drawer stash. 4 different kinds of energy bars and enough caffeine to power a small country. You've been snooping in my desk." "Market research." He pulled her closer, his chest warm against her back as they watched the city lights come alive. Getting to know the real Lennon Saylor, one protein bar flavor at a time. She tilted her head back to study his face in the fading light. "And what have you learned?" "That you're nothing like what I expected." His fingers traced lazy patterns on her arm. "You're ambitious, but not ruthless. Strong, but not hard. You keep chocolate-covered espresso beans in your bottom drawer for emergencies, and you cry at pet adoption commercials when you think no one's watching." "I do not." "I saw you last week, during the lunch break. That commercial with the 3-legged dog." She elbowed him gently. "Stalker. Observer." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I'm trying to see you clearly now. No ghosts, no projections, no fantasies, just you." The words warmed her more than the spring evening. They'd come so far from that first night, from mistaken identities and desperate grief. But there were still moments when she caught him looking at old photos. Still days when the weight of memory pressed too heavily on them both. "Tell me about the accident," she said quietly. It was the one topic they'd never fully discussed, the tragedy that had set their whole story in motion. She felt him tense behind her, but didn't retreat. This was part of healing too, facing the hard truths, the painful memories, the moments that had shaped them both. "It was raining," he began, his voice distant. "Like that night at the summit. She was driving home from her studio. She taught art to kindergartners. Did I ever tell you that? She could make anything beautiful, even finger paintings by 5-year-olds. His arms tightened around her as he continued. "The other driver was drunk, ran a red light. They said she died instantly, that she didn't suffer. As if that was supposed to make it better somehow." Lennon turned in his embrace, pressing her forehead to his chest where his heart beat steady and strong. "It wasn't your fault. I know that now. But for a long time, I was supposed to pick her up that night, had a late meeting, asked her to drive herself. If I'd just stop." She caught his face between her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You can't live in what-ifs. Trust me, I've tried. After my father died, I spent months torturing myself with maybes and should-haves. It doesn't bring them back. It just stops us from living." Something shifted in his expression, recognition, understanding, a shared pain that needed no explanation. You never told me about your father. You never asked. She smiled to soften the words. You were too busy seeing Marina's ghost to notice Lennon's scars. He flinched, but didn't look away. Tell me now, please. So she did. Told him about the heart attack that had taken her father too young, about the scholarship that had put her through business school, about the drive to succeed that came from wanting to make him proud. As she spoke, she felt something unlock between them, a new level of intimacy that had nothing to do with physical attraction or shared grief. I love you, she said when she finished, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Not because of her, because of you, because of who we are together, scars and all. He didn't say it back, but he kissed her like a drowning man finding air, like she was precious and real and entirely herself. When they broke apart, both breathing heavily, she saw no ghosts in his eyes, only her own reflection, clear and true. Later that night, as they lay tangled in his sheets, he traced the lines of her face with gentle fingers. I had her photos moved to storage today. The confession hung in the air between them. The shrine wall that had haunted them both was now bare, waiting for new memories to fill it. Are you sure you're ready? She propped herself up on an elbow to study him in the moonlight. No. His honesty was its own kind of love. But I'm ready to try, ready to stop living in the past and start building something new, with you, if you'll have me. Even with all my protein bars and crying at commercials. His laugh rumbled through his chest where she lay against him, especially because of those things. They make you you, not a replacement or a second chance or a ghost, just Lennon, my Lennon. Outside, the city hummed with life, cars honking, sirens wailing, 8 million stories unfolding in the darkness. But in this room, in this moment, there was only this. 2 hearts learning to beat in sync, 2 souls finding their way back to life through the maze of grief and guilt and second chances. They weren't perfect. They weren't even fully healed. But they were real. And they were trying. And sometimes that was enough. She fell asleep in his arms, dreaming not of ghosts, but of tomorrows. Chapter 11. Final battle. Marina's parents threatened to pull their company's massive account unless Lennon left Edison Communications. The ultimatum came during a tense board meeting, delivered with the kind of quiet dignity that made it even more devastating. Chen Global represents 15% of our annual revenue, George Chen reminded the board, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly simmering beneath the surface. We've been with Edison Communications since before my daughter met Dane, but we cannot, will not, continue to do business with a company that shows such disrespect for her memory. The boardroom fell silent. 15%. In the corporate world, those numbers meant everything. Jobs, futures, careers, all hanging in the balance because of one night of mistaken identity and the complicated aftermath that followed. I'll resign, Lennon offered, standing before anyone could speak. Her voice didn't waver, though her hands trembled where they rested on the polished table. Effective immediately. But Dane rose before she could continue, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fate turning on its axis. No. The single word carried enough authority to make even Marina's father pause. Dane moved to stand beside Lennon, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, but not quite touching, still maintaining that careful professional distance they'd cultivated. Mr. Chen, he began, his voice carrying that same quiet dignity that had made George's threat so effective. I loved your daughter. Part of me always will. She was light and laughter and everything good in this world. But Lennon, he paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. The entire board held its breath, watching this drama unfold in the same room where countless business deals had been made and broken. Lennon taught me how to live again, he continued finally. Not by replacing Marina, not by being her ghost, but by being exactly who she is. Brilliant, challenging, completely her own person. She took a failing account and turned it into our most successful campaign of the year. She faced public scrutiny and private pain with grace I can only admire. And yes, we met under complicated circumstances, but I'm done apologizing for finding happiness again. Mrs. Chen made a soft sound of distress, but her husband held up a hand to silence her. "You speak of happiness," he said, his accent thickening with emotion. "What about Marina's happiness? What about her dreams, her plans, her future, all destroyed in an instant? Marina's dead." The words fell like bombs in the quiet room. Dane's voice cracked but didn't break. "She's dead, and no amount of punishment or penance will bring her back. Do you think this is what she would have wanted, for all of us to stop living because she did? You dare presume to know what our daughter would have wanted." Mrs. Chen's composure finally broke. "You, who replaced her so quickly with this copy. I'm not her copy." Lennon spoke quietly but firmly, drawing every eye in the room. "I never tried to be. Yes, I look like her, a cosmic coincidence that brought me into Dane's orbit. But I'm not gentle or artistic or serene. I'm ambitious and complicated and sometimes difficult. I cry at commercials but negotiate like a shark. I can't cook to save my life, and I drink too much coffee, and I'm not trying to replace anyone. I'm just trying to love a man who's finally learning to live again." The confession hung in the air, too honest for this room of corporate politics and power plays. Mrs. Chen's hands trembled where they clutched her designer handbag. Her husband's face was a mask of conflicting emotions. "Love?" His voice was bitter. "You speak of love when you built your relationship on lies? On a night of mistaken identity?" "No." Dane's hand found Lennon's under the table, their fingers twining together out of sight. "We built our relationship on truth, hard, painful, complicated truth. That night at the bar, that was about grief and loneliness and, yes, physical resemblance. But everything since then, that's been about choosing to see each other clearly, about facing our demons together, about building something real from the ashes of tragedy." He turned to face the board, his spine straight and his voice steady. "I choose her. I choose life. If that costs us the Chen Global account, so be it. We'll survive. We'll adapt. We'll find new clients who judge us on the quality of our work rather than the personal lives of our employees. And if we don't," Howard Blackwood, the senior board member, spoke for the first time. 15%, Dane. That's not something we can ignore. "Then I'll step down." The words sent shockwaves through the room. "I'll sell my controlling shares, retire to a beach somewhere, let someone else run this company. But I won't sacrifice Lennon to appease anyone's sense of propriety or misplaced loyalty to Marina's memory." Lennon's heart stopped. He would give up everything, his company, his legacy, his life's work, for her. The realization made her dizzy. "I won't let you do that," she whispered, but he squeezed her hand under the table. "It's not your choice to make," he murmured back. Then, louder, "I built this company from nothing, turned it into one of the most respected agencies in New York. But what's the point of success if we let it cost us our humanity? What's the point of living if we're too afraid to love again?" Mrs. Chen made a soft sound, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. "You sound just like her." "What?" Dane's composure cracked slightly. "Marina. She always said you worked too hard, cared too much about the company. Said someday you'd have to choose between your empire and your heart." Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. I guess she was right. A heavy silence fell over the room. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, New York continued its endless dance of traffic and commerce, unaware of the drama unfolding 50 stories up. Finally, George Chen spoke. Tell me about the Reynolds campaign. The non sequitur caught everyone off guard. Lennon blinked, her professional instincts kicking in despite the emotional tension. I'm sorry? The campaign you mentioned. The one that saved the account. Tell me about it. So she did. With trembling hands but steady voice, she outlined the strategy that had turned a potential disaster into a triumph. As she spoke, she felt the energy in the room shift. This was her element. Not emotional confrontations or boardroom drama, but the work itself. The creativity, the innovation, the results that had nothing to do with who she looked like or who she loved. When she finished, George was nodding slowly. Impressive. Very impressive. Marina always said Edison Communications was the best in the business. I see she was right about that too. He turned to his wife, some silent communication passing between them. Then, to everyone's shock, he smiled. A small, sad thing, but genuine. We'll keep our account here, he announced, on one condition. The room held its breath. Dane's hand tightened on Lennon's. Stop hiding, George said simply. Stop pretending this is just about business or coincidence or grief. If you love each other, really love each other, then honor that love by being honest about it. No more scandals, no more secrets, just truth. And Marina's memory, Dane asked softly, will always be sacred. Mrs. Chen spoke up, her voice thick with tears. But she wouldn't want us destroying ourselves or each other in her name. She loved life too much for that. The tension in the room finally broke. Board members relaxed in their chairs, relief evident on their faces. Howard Blackwood started discussing damage control and PR strategies, but Lennon barely heard any of it. She was watching Dane, seeing the subtle changes in his expression as the weight of years of grief finally began to lift. He turned to her, his eyes clearer than she'd ever seen them. I love you, he said, not caring who heard. Not because of her, because of you. Because you fought for us, even when I couldn't. Because you saw me, really saw me, when I was lost in grief and guilt and confusion. Her answering smile was bright enough to chase away any lingering ghosts. I love you too, all of you. The brilliant CEO, the grieving fiancé, the man who's finally learning to live again. Then marry me. The words silenced the room once again. Even the Chens stopped their quiet conversation to stare. What? Lennon's heart thundered in her chest. Marry me, he repeated, turning to face her fully. Not because you look like her, not because I'm trying to recreate the past, but because you make me want a future. Because you challenge me and fight me and love me exactly as I am. Because when I think about tomorrow and next year and 10 years from now, the only thing I'm sure of is that I want you by my side. Mrs. Chen made a soft sound that might have been approval or might have been pain. George's face was unreadable. The board members shifted uncomfortably, unused to such raw emotion in their sanctuary of spreadsheets and profit margins. But Lennon saw none of them. She saw only Dane, his eyes clear and focused, no ghosts haunting their depths. This wasn't the man who had kissed her in a storm-dark bar, seeing only what he wanted to see. This wasn't the grieving CEO trying to recapture past happiness. This was just Dane, choosing her, choosing life, choosing love in all its messy, complicated glory. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes. The kiss they shared was neither desperate nor haunted. It was a beginning, a promise, a future unfolding before them like the city spread out below their windows. And if Marina watched from somewhere beyond, Lennon thought she might be smiling, not because her fiancé had found her replacement, but because he had finally found himself again. The war was over. Love, in all its imperfect glory, had won. Chapter 12. Ever After. The charity gala was their first public appearance as an engaged couple. The Edison Communications Annual Arts Foundation benefit had always been Marina's favorite event. She'd helped establish the foundation that provided art supplies and education to underprivileged children. Now, 6 months after that fateful board meeting, it became the stage for Dane and Lennon's official debut. Whispers followed them through the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. Behind crystal champagne flutes and designer clutches, New York's elite traded theories and rumors. But this time, Lennon held her head high. Her emerald green gown, deliberately nothing like anything Marina had ever worn, sparkled under the chandeliers. The engagement ring on her finger caught the light with every gesture. Its design modern and unique, chosen to represent their future rather than echo the past. "Let them talk," Dane murmured, leading her onto the dance floor as the opening notes of Wicked Game filled the air. He'd specifically requested their song, turning what could have been a painful reminder into a celebration of their journey. "You look beautiful." She did, but not because she resembled anyone else. Her beauty came from confidence, from the fire in her eyes, from the way she carried herself like a woman who knew exactly who she was and whom she loved. The marketing director who had saved the Reynolds account was now one of New York's most sought-after advertising executives. Her success built on talent rather than coincidence. "I love you," he said for the first time in public, his voice carrying just enough for those nearest to hear. "The real you. Only you." She smiled through tears that threatened to fall. "Took you long enough." His answering laugh was free from the shadows that had haunted it for so long. "I'll spend the rest of my life making up for lost time." They danced, lost in their own world, despite the hundreds of watching eyes. Across the room, Marina's portrait hung alongside other foundation benefactors. But now, it was just a picture. Beautiful, cherished, but no longer a ghost haunting their every moment. The Chens were there, watching from a quiet corner. Mrs. Chen dabbed at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief as she watched them dance. Her husband's arm was steady around her shoulders, his own expression a complex mixture of grief and acceptance, and something that might have been hope. Lennon had visited Marina's grave with them last week. It had been her idea, a way to honor the woman who had unknowingly brought them together, while firmly establishing that she wasn't trying to take her place. She'd placed sunflowers, Marina's favorite, and spent a quiet moment thanking her predecessor for loving Dane enough to show him how to open his heart again. "Marry me," he whispered against her lips as the song drew to a close. She laughed softly. "You already asked. I already said yes." "I know." His eyes sparkled with mischief and joy, expressions that would have seemed foreign on his face a year ago. "But I like hearing you say it. Say it again." "Yes," she answered, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. 1,000 times yes. The room erupted in applause, not for their dance, but for the kiss they shared at its conclusion. A kiss that spoke of love and healing and second chances. A kiss that said, "This is real, and this is right, and this is exactly where we're meant to be." Sophie appeared at their side as they left the dance floor, wiping away tears of her own. "If anyone had told me a year ago that your drunken one-night stand would end like this." "Life has a funny way of working out," Lennon agreed, squeezing her friend's hand. "Thank you for being there through all of it." "Are you kidding? This is better than any romance novel. Speaking of which," she gestured to where a reporter from the New York Times was waiting patiently nearby. "They want your love story for the Sunday Style section." Dane's arm tightened around Lennon's waist. "What do you think? Ready to tell the world?" She considered for a moment. "Yes. The real story, all of it. The mistakes, the grief, the healing. Maybe someone else out there needs to hear that it's okay to live again, to love again, to be exactly who you are instead of who people expect you to be." His kiss was soft, reverent. Have I told you today how much I love you? Only about 12 times, but I'm keeping count, so don't let me stop you. The reporter's interview became the talk of New York society, not because of scandal or speculation, but because of its raw honesty. They spoke of that stormy night, of mistaken identity and grief-clouded judgment, of the long journey from confusion to clarity, from guilt to acceptance, from seeing ghosts to seeing each other. Outside the hotel, another storm raged, nature's way of bringing their story full circle. But this time, they faced it together. Dane held an umbrella over them as they waited for their car, protecting Lennon's elaborate updo from the rain. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. She pretended to think about it. "Well, I did have to buy all new protein bars when you reorganized my desk drawer." His laugh echoed off the plaza's marble facade. "I was trying to implement an efficient alphabetical system. Control freak. Organizational disaster. Your organizational disaster," she reminded him. "Always," he promised, and sealed it with a kiss that tasted like champagne and happiness and forever. Later that night, in the penthouse that had become their home, Lennon stood at the window watching the storm. The wall that had once held Marina's shrine now displayed different photos. Lennon and Dane at the Reynolds account celebration, the two of them in Central Park, candid shots that captured real moments instead of posed perfection. Marina's photos had their own special album, preserved with love and respect, but no longer haunting their daily lives. "What are you thinking about?" Dane asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "How sometimes the wrong turn leads you exactly where you're meant to be." He turned her in his arms, studying her face in the storm-lit darkness. "No more wrong turns. No more mistakes. No more seeing anything but exactly who you are. The woman I love, the woman I choose, the woman I want to spend the rest of my life getting to know better every day. Even when I steal the covers. Even then. Even when I drink the last coffee without making more. Now that might be grounds for divorce." She swatted his arm, laughing. The sound echoed through their home filled with both their personalities, both their quirks, both their hearts. The storm outside began to ease, stars peeking through breaks in the clouds. Below them, the city that had witnessed their entire story sparkled like scattered diamonds. Somewhere out there was the summit, where everything had begun. Somewhere out there was Edison Communications, where they had fought and grown and learned to love despite all odds. And here, in this moment, was their future, built not on mistakes or grief or ghostly resemblances, but on choice, on truth, on the kind of love that comes after the storms, stronger for having weathered them together. "Dance with me?" he asked, holding out his hand. There was no music playing, but they didn't need any. They swayed together in the starlight, writing their own melody, their own story, their own happily ever after. Sometimes the greatest love stories start with a mistake. Sometimes the wrong turn leads you exactly where you're meant to be. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find someone who sees you exactly as you are and loves you not in spite of it, but because of it. The end.